Well, it is Wednesday, and that means it is time for Prime Minister's Questions, the weekly political clash in the UK's House of Commons. Today, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer faces off against opposition leader Kemi Badenoch as they tackle some of the week's most pressing issues, including rising energy costs, the new stamp duty regulations that took effect yesterday, and President Trump's impending tariff announcement. With tough questions, fiery exchanges, and high political stakes, the session promises to be intense and unmissable. Let's go live to Westminster for all the latest developments now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Belfast Chamber, which represents 600 businesses, warned that many Northern Irish businesses are being forced to freeze growth plans, halt recruitment, and in some cases cut jobs to absorb rising costs as a consequence of rising employer national insurance contributions, due to take effect in just 4 days. So can I ask the Secretary of State, what impact assessment has the Northern Ireland Office made regarding the impact of those tax rises on SMEs? And also, what practical discussions is the Secretary of State having with the Northern Ireland Executive to support SMEs, which are the future of Northern Ireland's growth?
Well, of course, the increase in employers' national insurance is going to be difficult for some firms. That is clearly the case. But, as I said, the Northern Ireland economy has the fastest rate of growth, growing faster than the rest of the United Kingdom. It has low unemployment, and the rest of questions today has highlighted the huge areas of potential that the Northern Ireland economy has to continue to grow and to create new jobs and new businesses.
Minister Mikewood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Ireland Farming Minister estimates that 3/4 of dairy farms in Northern Ireland could be hit by inheritance tax following the Chancellor's disastrous changes. Given the particularly high cost of agricultural land compared to farming incomes in Northern Ireland, does the Secretary of State recognise that the budget is a direct threat to family farms and thousands of livelihoods across Northern Ireland?
Well, I would say that the figures that the Honourable Gentleman has just referred to do not reflect the assessment that the Treasury has made about the number of farms that will be affected, which is based on claims that were submitted in the past. I understand the concern that the farming industry has got, but the Treasury is very clear, one, that it will not hit a majority of farms, and two, we have to do something about very big landowners who buy a lot of land in order to avoid inheritance tax.
Jenny Riddle-Carpenter.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public sector reform is a priority for this government, and I very regularly meet with Northern Ireland executive ministers. Unions and public service providers. Most recently, the government and executive agreed £129 million of funding for public service transformation for health, special educational needs, justice and wastewater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Minister has said about public service reform being a shared challenge. Does she agree with me that it's in the interest of patients and people in Northern Ireland and in England for the Executive and the Government to share knowledge and best practice about what works?
Minister.
I absolutely agree. This issue of public service transformation is not about funding, it's about how to spend the money that the Northern Ireland Executive has got with a record £18.2 billion settlement. Health is devolved, but we work together to share best practice, expertise, as well as agreeing £61 million of funding recently for multidisciplinary teams in GP surgeries. We need jointly to create an NHS fit for the future and to work together to do that, and I'll be meeting with the Health Minister again in Northern Ireland this week.
Mr. Speaker, any future discussions that she will have with Northern Ireland ministers about the reform of the public sector, will she ensure that it includes the need for many parts of that public sector to ensure that their employment practices and procedures result in workforces that are more broadly representative of the working age population, as the unionist community in many sectors are underrepresented and have been in the public sector for many years?
Minister.
challenges are a huge part of public service transformation. There are workers across Northern Ireland doing fantastic work in health, in education, in justice, and they need to be supported to do that and to be representative of the community. Those issues about workforce are a devolved issue, but they are important. But supporting our workforce, working with unions as well to do this, is an important part of our working together in an active partnership with the Executive.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I wish to inform the House about my recent trip to Ukraine. It was at the invitation of Ruslan Stefanchuk, chairman of the Rada in Ukraine. I joined speakers from across Europe in a memorial service to mark the 3rd anniversary of the Bucha massacre and to hear the important testimony of the survivors of this terrible atrocity. I also delivered a speech at the Bucha summit, which was opened by the President of Ukraine, and took with me specific cross-party messages of solidarity from the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Democrats. The appreciation felt by the people of Ukraine at the support offered by this House, the people of the United Kingdom, should not be underestimated. Indeed, his nightly address on Monday, President Zelensky explicitly expressed his thanks to the United Kingdom for the support provided to them. Order, order. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. John Grady.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, just picking up on your comments, can I say that on Monday night I spoke to President Zelensky and he wanted me to pass on to you his thanks for attending in Ukraine, particularly on the 3rd anniversary of the massacre at Bucha, which I've been to Bucha. It's a terrible, terrible 3rd anniversary, so I pass on those thanks. Mr. Speaker, we've been preparing for all eventualities ahead of the confirmation of US tariffs later today. Let me be clear with the House, a trade war is in nobody's interests, and the country deserves, and we will take, a calm, pragmatic approach. That's why constructive talks are progressing to agree a wider economic prosperity deal with the US. That's why we're working with all industries and sectors likely to be impacted. Our decisions will always be guided by our national interest, and that's why we have prepared for all eventualities, and we will rule nothing out. Mr. Speaker, our deepest sympathies are with the people of Myanmar and Thailand. We are sending immediate life-saving support to assist their efforts. May I also extend my personal condolences to the family, friends and colleagues of Christina McKelvey. She was much loved and will be sorely missed, especially by our colleagues in the SNP here and in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the full state pension will rise by £472 a year, putting money in the pockets of pensioners in Glasgow and across the United Kingdom. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this rise is only possible because of Labour's plan for change and our commitment to the triple lock?
Well, he's absolutely right. We can commit to triple lock because we've restored stability after they crashed the economy. And that means, Mr. Speaker, next week 12 million pensioners will receive up to £470 more. That's an extra £1,900 over this Parliament, including 1 million pensioners in Scotland. And the contrast couldn't be clearer. The Shadow Chancellor called the triple lock unsustainable, and the Leader of the Opposition wants to means test the state pension so that she can cut it.
Leader of the Opposition, can we bear it up?
Mr. Speaker, the triple lock was a Conservative policy. Rather than...
Order. I know... You was is inadvertently said. Carry on, Lee.
Rather than the Prime Minister congratulating himself for what we did, why don't we talk about what he's doing? From Sunday, Labour's jobs tax will mean many British businesses face a terrible choice: to cut wages, put up prices, or sack their staff. What is the Prime Minister's advice to those businesses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she says the triple lock was Conservative policy. It was once thought to be the party of sound finances, but they blew all of that. Mr. Speaker, she asked what we're doing. We're clearing up the mess that they left. We're dealing with global instability, and we recognise the pressures that are bearing down on businesses and individuals and working people. That's why we're rolling up our sleeves. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to announce the national living wage increasing by £1,400. That's a pay rise for millions of workers. We've announced £150 for the Warm Homes discount, extended now to 6 million households. That's 1 in 5 families. And wages are going up faster than prices. And never forget, the party opposite, worst living standards on record, inflation up to 11%, public services left on their knees.
Mr. Speaker, the only mess is the one that he made with his budget. They had an emergency budget last week that fixed nothing. He says he's bringing stability. All we see is fragility. During the election, the Prime Minister also promised that he would not increase taxes on working people. But even the OBR says that the jobs tax will be passed on to workers. On average, families will be £3,500 poorer. Why should anyone trust him again?
Well, her fantasy figure is about as much use as Liz Truss's economic planning. And she turns up every week to carp from the sidelines about the decisions we made at the budget. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, she held a press conference and she couldn't say whether she would reverse the decisions that we made at the budget. Now, I understand, because she can't bring herself to say that she doesn't want the investment of an extra £26 billion in our NHS. I'm not surprised at that. That's 2 million extra appointments, that's 1,000 more GPs, a pay rise for nurses, etc., etc. But let me get her position right if I can follow it. She wants the extra £26 billion in the NHS, Mr. Speaker, that was paid for by the national insurance rise. She wants that. She doesn't want to reverse the national insurance rises. So she's now reduced this absurd position of voting in the budget, carping against a budget that she actually agrees with.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with making people poorer. I don't agree with pensioner poverty. I don't agree. They are calling it awful April. That's because of decisions he has made, because he made promises and broke them. His promises are worthless, Mr. Speaker. People are getting poorer. Before the election, he pledged to freeze council tax. Instead, it's going up everywhere, even in Birmingham, where there's 17,000 tonnes of rubbish uncollected on the streets. Does the Prime Minister regret promising the British people he would freeze their council tax when he has so obviously failed?
Well, I have to ask, if she doesn't want people poorer, why didn't she resign when she was in government? Mr. Speaker, the last government put up council tax for 12 years in a row. She, I think, was actually Minister for Council Tax. And in the year she's been, what she do? She put it up. And even now, the Conservatives' own Local Government Association manifesto, so currently their position, page 9, we asked the government to remove the caps on council tax. So who's leading the charge? Hampshire County Council, they wanted a 15% hike, we said no. Slough Council wanted a hike, we said no. Windsor and Maidenhead was Tory, now Lib Dem, they wanted a hike and we said no. And it's no surprise that council tax is £300 cheaper under Labour councils than under Tory councils.
Mr. Speaker, he doesn't want to talk about Birmingham, and that's because he knows the situation. So I'll say it again. 17,000 tonnes of rubbish on Birmingham streets. Normally, a state of emergency is called for natural disasters, not Labour ones. His policy policies have left our economy dangerously fragile. The Chancellor, once again, left herself no room for manoeuvre. Economic experts, real economists, say she will either have to break her fiscal rules or put up taxes. Which will it be?
Prime Minister.
I think she must have picked up the script she was using a few weeks ago. Because it was only then she was saying, in the spring statement, you're going to put up taxes. But look, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the situation in Birmingham, it is completely unacceptable. I fully support the Council in declaring it a major incident to resolve the situation, and we'll put in whatever additional support is needed. But when the party opposite was in government, we lost more days to strike action than in any year since the 1980s. Workers were on the picket line, not on the front line, and that sent waiting lists through the roof, so we'll take no lectures on industrial harmony from them.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House would have heard that he didn't say whether or not he could keep his fiscal rules. That means that it's either that or putting up taxes. 9 months ago, we left Labour the fastest growing economy in the G7. We did. And I remember watching his MPs laughing at their first destructive budget. They've had another one that has made our economy dangerously vulnerable. The Bank of England says his policies have pushed up the cost of living for families. Does he disagree with the bank, or does he accept his policies mean higher bills?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, she must be the only person left in the country who actually thinks they did well on the economy when they were in power. That was what was tested at the last election. Living standards the worst on record. Inflation 11% it soared up to. The NHS on its knees. Oh, Mr. Speaker, she's so obsessed with talking down the country that she's not read the OBR forecast properly. Growth up in 2026, 2027 up, 2028 up, 2029 up. And thanks to our planning reforms, the largest growth measure the OBR have ever costed. And what did the Tories do when the bill came before Parliament? They abstained. Well, you don't grow the economy or build houses by yourself. They're the same old party. They haven't changed. Nothing's new.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about inflation. We left it at 2%. It is now twice what the OBR forecast when we were in government. The fact is, his decisions have made our economy fragile, just as we face global trade wars. In November, I urged him to seize the draft US trade deal Conservatives negotiated. Instead, Mr. Speaker, he lost our most experienced trade negotiator. It's no wonder he can't get a tariff deal for British cars. On this side of the House, we secured investments for that industry. £600 million from BMW, £2 billion from Nissan, £4 billion from Jaguar Land Rover. Labour's record is a car industry in crisis, even before tariffs. There are 25,000 more jobs now at risk. He says he's preparing for eventualities. Can the Prime Minister tell us exactly what he is doing to protect the British car industry from his failure to negotiate?
We're taking a calm, pragmatic approach and keeping our feet on the ground. There are constructive talks that are ongoing on a wider economic prosperity deal with the US. That is really important at this moment. We are working with all sectors that are likely to be impacted, and we're guided by our national interest at all times. And that's why we've said we won't rule anything out. But it is important at a moment like this that we don't have knee-jerk reactions, that we are actually cool-headed about this, and that's why we won't rule anything out. But she must be. She's the Trade Secretary. She was the Trade Secretary, Mr. Speaker, who failed to get a trade deal with the US.
Mr. Speaker, today the Trump administration will announce new tariffs that will hurt working people in the US and around the world. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that at a time when big tech has grown fat by corrupting our politics and preying on young people, that the wrong approach would be to pander to his bullying tactics and detect millionaires in his imperial court by cutting the digital services tax? Can he assure the public that the poorest won't get cuts while the richest get a free ride?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this. It is an important issue, and there are issues in relation to Northern Ireland in particular that we have to deal with very carefully. We will, Mr. Speaker, always put the national interest first, and that's why I'm pleased that talks are ongoing and they're constructive talks. I do believe that a trade war is in nobody's interest, and all of the sectors and industries impacted are of the same view. So we'll continue to make that progress in the national interest.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the earlier remarks of the Prime Minister, particularly about Myanmar and Thailand? And can I support the aid that is going, and hope that despite the budget cuts we can be as generous as possible because of the humanitarian crisis there? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has shown commendable leadership over Ukraine with his plan for a military coalition of the willing against Putin. Will he now provide similar leadership with an economic coalition of the willing against Trump's tariffs for free trade, so we can avoid a global trade war and a global recession?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think every week he tries to tempt me to make what I think is a false choice between our relationship with the US and our relationship with other countries, particularly Europe. I think that's the wrong choice on defence, on security and intelligence, for reasons that we've rehearsed across this chamber. I also think it's wrong on trade and the economy. We have a good deal of trade, a balanced trade relationship with the US, and I believe that our interests are best served by calmly trying to secure a deal which is in our national interest, whilst at the same time preparing and leaving all options on the table.
Sir Ed Davey.
Minister's reply. I hope he is able to cut a deal, but I increasingly fear that the deal won't be good enough to avoid a global trade war. That's why I think one of the options must be to work with our European allies, our Commonwealth allies and others, because if we don't tackle Trump's tariffs, we could be saying goodbye to free trade for a generation. Mr. Speaker, if I may turn to a domestic matter now. 3 years ago, the American private equity firm KKR bought a 25% stake in Northumbrian Water. Since then, people across the North East have seen their water bills soar, whilst in last year alone, Northumbrian Water has dumped nearly 1 million tonnes of raw sewage into Durham's Whitburn Coast Conservation Area. KKR are now poised to buy into Thames Water because ministers have ruled out a special administration regime. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that Thames Water will not be allowed to repeat the same trick of putting up bills and dumping raw sewage at the same time? They allowed it, he shouldn't.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in relation to his comments at the beginning of the question, I really do think it's not sensible to say the first response should be to jump in to a trade war with the US. That cannot be the first response of the United Kingdom, and I will resist his urgings to do that. In relation to water, he's absolutely right to point out the appalling record on water of the party opposite, just like the record on everything was appalling, and that's why I'm really pleased that we passed the Water Act already to take the necessary measures, but we will go further.
Deputy.
Yesterday, the Work and Pension Select Committee visited Manchester, where we saw the power of devolution in action, in this case helping people find work. So with just 5 percentage points separating Labour and Conservative last time, does the Prime Minister agree that to get the maximum advantage from Labour's devolution offer, the West of England needs an ambitious Labour mayor in Helen Godwin for more jobs, to fix our buses and to get the homes we need built?
I believe it's best for communities when their leaders have skin in the game Helen Godwin grew up in Stapleton, went to college in Filton, and has a great record fighting for the community where she's raising her family. Mr. Speaker, our plan for change has delivered record funding for the West of England. That's more money for better buses, for potholes, and getting young people into work. That's the difference a Labour mayor working with a Labour government delivers for the West of England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that many in the House will be assuaged by his suggestion that he will act in the national interest in relation to tariffs. But most won't have considered that in acting in the national interest, what occurs in Northern Ireland is no longer solely in his control. He knows that exports from Northern Ireland are UK exports, rightly so. Yet imports to Northern Ireland could lay at the consequence of EU retaliatory action. In keeping all of his options open, now we have to live in a world with the consequences of the last government with his support. Will he indicate that he is prepared to take steps to either exempt Northern Ireland from EU action or take retaliatory action if they do not?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank him for raising this issue, which is of real importance to his constituents and everybody in Northern Ireland. It is a very serious issue. That's why we need to be calm and pragmatic. And I think that's what workers and businesses in Northern Ireland would want to see from this government at a time like this. We are, as he would expect, looking carefully at the details of any retaliatory tariffs announced by the EU, if they are, and what impact they might have on businesses. As he knows, where goods do not enter the EU, then businesses can claim a full reimbursement of any EU duties paid. But I reassure in the interests of Northern Ireland at the forefront of our decisions, and he may want to know that this morning the Business Secretary spoke to the Northern Ireland Executive because this is a serious issue and we need to work together to resolve it in the interests of everybody in Northern Ireland.
Mike Chapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the last government resorted to damaging keyboard diplomacy, this government is leading, bringing 40 nations together this week to tackle illegal immigration. Like the Prime Minister, I've seen firsthand how counter-terror powers can disrupt threats before lives are lost. That same approach is essential in dismantling the smuggling networks, Mr. Speaker. Does he agree? It's time the Conservatives and Reform dropped the posturing, put national security first and backed our Borders Bill.
Well, I mean, the party opposite tried an open borders experiment. We are now tackling illegal migration. They talked about flights, Mr. Speaker. We've already removed 24,000 people with no right to be here. Under their Rwanda scheme, which was only ever supposed to return, I think, 300 people a year, what we've achieved in 9 months would have taken them 80 years. We've replaced a gimmick with a real deterrent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has spoken very movingly and with genuine sincerity and affection about his time as a young man in the Langdale Valley and the Lake District in my constituency and how that helped to shape him. So I wonder if he's aware that the hill farmers who maintain those stunning landscapes in the lakes and elsewhere will be earning on average significantly less or barely half the national minimum wage due to cuts in their income, despite the fact they provide the backdrop to the remarkably important tourism economy. So would you agree to meet with me and upland farmers in the lakes and the dales so we can design a scheme together to end this poverty and equip our hill farmers to produce food and protect our epic landscapes for generations to come?
He and I share a love of the Lake District, and we still go back there with our children now. This is a serious issue, obviously, and that's why we've put a record amount into farming at the budget, but also set out our roadmap. But I'll happily make sure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to go through that and to take on board any points he has to make in relation to it.
Any bills?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of residents in my constituency at Union Park are facing massive £1 million worth of charges to repair their heating system, to repair fire safety works that haven't been put right by the developer, who has now declared bankruptcy and walked away. Their new freeholder has washed their hands of responsibility and instead is leveraging huge ground rent bills and fines against those residents. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? This is exactly why we have to move forward with our plan, much delayed from the party opposite, to abolish the outdated leasehold system once and for all as part of our plan for change.
Prime Minister. The Deputy Prime Minister is saying absolutely in my ear. Mr. Speaker, we will end the feudal leasehold system, which has left millions of homeowners subject to unfair costs and unreasonable practices. Our reforms include clear standards for repairs and maintenance, and this will give homeowners a greater say in how their homes are managed. And I know the Housing Minister will have heard what he said.
Mr. Speaker, this Labour government has failed the British public at every turn. They have abandoned the WASPy women, leaving them without compensation they deserve. They have turned their backs on pensioners by failing to support the winter fuel allowance. They have let down children by keeping the two-child benefit cap in place, and they will inflict further hardship on the most vulnerable by slashing $5 billion from benefits. But perhaps the most immediate and visible failure, one that poses an immediate and direct health risk to the people of Birmingham, is the appalling financial mismanagement of Labour-run Birmingham City Council. After more than a decade of Labour control, their incompetence has led to mountains of uncollected rubbish piling up on every street, so vast that it can be seen from satellites orbiting space. It is nothing short of a disgrace and a damning indictment of Labour's inability to govern. Will the Prime Minister take urgent action to protect the public health and the people of Birmingham